Hey, Peaceniks. Today's guest is Scott Deitche. He's an author specializing in organized crime and the Mafia. Scott has written 7 books and over 50 articles on organized crime for local and national magazines and newspapers. He has been featured on History Channel, A&E, Discovery Channel, AHC, C-SPAN, and Oxygen Network. And I had a great conversation with him. His new book is Hitmen, the Mafia, Drugs, and the East Harlem Purple Gang. He lives in Tampa, so he's not far from us here in Fort Myers. He's up in Tampa, and he talked a lot about the Mafia in Tampa and Ybor, and I thought it was pretty cool. Things I didn't know, the Mafia presence up there in Tampa. Talks about Miami, talks about New York, Atlantic City. It's some history. We talk about the ways that illegal drug market has affected the Mafia, has affected different areas of our culture. We talk about all the mythology around, the Mafia and the movies and television shows. So really cool conversation. I'm glad I got to talk to him. I know you're going to enjoy this. Before we dive in, real quick, if you want to smoke a hemp cigarette that doesn't taste like shit, this is their motto, and I agree with them. Go to sugarcali.com. Get some hemp cigarettes. It's a great alternative to tobacco. Nicotine free. You can enjoy a cigarette while having your favorite beverage. And they have original flavor, vanilla and mint. All 3 are good. I've tried all 3. I honestly do enjoy them. Go to sugarcali.com. Enter the offer code PEACE15, PEACE 15 to get 15% off and help support the podcast. Also, if you like Kratom, as I do, and you buy Kratom, you can go to happyhippoherbals.com. They have really good prices on the powder. They have yellow vein, white vein, red vein, green vein. They have taffy. They have chewables. They have little shot bottles you can buy. But if you like Kratom, you use Kratom, go to happyhippoherbals.com and enter the offer code THEPEACE15 to get 15% off your Kratom needs. All right. Thank you so much for listening to the Peace on Drugs podcast. You're going to like this conversation with Scott Deitche. Again, his new book, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it Barnes & Noble. His new book is Hitmen, the Mafia, Drugs, and the East Harlem Purple Gang. So let's go ahead and dive in to this episode of the Peace on Drugs podcast with Scott Deitche.
America's public enemy number 1 in the United States is drug abuse.
Drugs are menacing our society.
What are your thoughts on the drug problem?
I had a great time doing drugs.
So tonight, from our family to yours, from our home to yours, thank you for joining us.
This is the Peace on Drugs.
All right. So, Scott, it's good to finally meet you.
Good to meet you as well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This is awesome. I started reading your book that you sent me. Thanks for sending that. The Hitmen, your new novel. Or not novel, I'm sorry. It would be more a biography or...
Yeah, nonfiction book. Yeah,
nonfiction
True
book.
crime.
True crime. There you go. And also, I'm listening. I got your book on Audible, the Garden State Gangland. I'm trying to get caught up because we moved the podcast a week ahead, so I try to cram some of it in. And I find I have a hard time following the Mafia stuff because there's so many characters, different families and names, and you're trying to keep track of everything. It's like trying to keep track, like Game of Thrones, except for just as gruesome but more characters. And but the general idea of it's really fascinating, and you seem to spent most of your life studying this stuff. So let me start with that. What got you into writing about the Mafia, and are you from that area up around New York?
Yeah, I was born in New Jersey, grew up there. Growing up, my mom liked watching the old mob movies. We used to get the news from New York City. So I remember when Paul Castellano was shot and killed, that coming over the news. And, it was always kind of around there. My paternal grandfather was a sports bookmaker, a legal bookmaker for a while. It was really after I saw the movie Goodfellas. I since relocated at that time to St. Pete, Florida for college. And so Goodfellas in the movies. And I was like, wow, this was great. I want to read the book this was based on. And I picked up the book Wise Guy. And then that just started reading about it, and it really just started off as kind of a general interest thing. And then it's like mid 95, I think, I was online when there wasn't really much online, but there was a text only Mafia website. People would just throw up information about the mob. And there was a gentleman on there, David Critchley from England, who we started corresponding. He says, "Hey, I have these congressional hearings that took place in Tampa in 1950, the Kefauver hearings." He says, "I see you're down there. Would you like to read them? They're all about the mob in Tampa." And I'm like, "Yeah, that sounds interesting." And then he sent me that, and that kind of opened the door. That's when it started veering from casual interest to obsession, borderline. And then from there, I started really digging into the first couple books, and most of the early stuff I wrote was primarily about the Mafia in Tampa and Florida, and I've since expanded out from there.
That's fascinating. And you don't hear a lot about the mob in Florida as much. It's all New York and stuff, but I guess is Florida kind of like a place where they seek refuge, go into hiding, or try to change their identity? Or
Yeah, so you had two things going on in Florida. You had Tampa, which actually had its own homegrown mafia family with ties back to Sicily and ties to New Orleans and New York. So they were an actual Florida-based crime family. And then the Miami, South Florida area was what they called an open city. So you had mobsters from all over the country going down there, whether it was New York or Boston, Chicago, Detroit. In fact, in the early 80s, they estimated over 600 mafia guys from all around the country were spending at least part of the year in South Florida, down in Fort Lauderdale, Miami area.
yeah, now I wonder if that was, were they there for the palm trees or to move cocaine? I mean, or a bit of both.
Yeah, so it started on really in the South Florida area, started primarily during Prohibition, but actually the earlier drug stuff you see was out of Tampa. They were running heroin and morphine via Havana in the 1920s while they were bringing in shipments of rum and illegal booze. Tampa was a huge early kind of part of the narcotics pipeline of the United States. In fact, in 1925, it's estimated that Tampa was the second largest port of entry, second to New York, for illegal narcotics in the United States.
See, and everybody would have assumed Miami. And I've even heard, I'm in Lee County, Fort Myers. So I've heard that the Caloosahatchee was another place that would come right in. So all coming through from Middle America to South America up through Florida.
Yeah, but the South Florida Miami stuff really starts kicking off in the 70s. So really, that's the rise of first you start with the Cuban organized crime groups that come over after Castro, and then the cocaine cowboys. And there's a lot of marijuana smuggling all throughout Florida in the 70s. A lot of the fishing villages, you hear that.
Yeah, and one thing you said in your book was that one of the great myths, you said one of the great myths perpetuated by Hollywood movies is that the mob shied away from narcotics, and nothing could be further from the truth. And it's weird because I've always associated the mob with drugs because the work I'm doing in the books that I'm reading, I immediately, there was even a theory that Anslinger was working with the mob when he outlawed drugs because of how much they benefited, though there's no evidence to support that. But it's just the correlations there because, I mean, the mob immediately benefited so much from the legal trade. But and I didn't think about it till you said that when I think about mobs in the movie, I think about them taking trucks full of Armani suits or jewelry or selling this or that, or even selling cigarettes over selling heroin. And why is it that Hollywood doesn't portray the mob as the drug peddlers that they were?
I think a lot of that, certainly if you look back, even The Godfather, there's a scene in there where there's not a lot of drug activity, but that's kind of one of the core plot points is them wanting to get into drugs. I think some of that information wasn't quite as readily available back then because the mob was so focused on labor racketeering, gambling. Gambling was a huge moneymaker for organized crime. Prohibition era with the liquor, that I think it wasn't as widely known how involved they were in narcotics, and that really didn't start coming out into the 1970s when it really became apparent that even going back to the early 19-teens. The early mafia guys, even someone like Arnold Rothstein, were heavily involved in the drug trade out of Europe.
Arnold Rothstein, he was a Jewish guy, right? That I think I read about him in Johan Hari's book. He did a whole piece on that guy. He was pretty hardcore, but it didn't end well for him. as it doesn't with a lot of them.
Yeah, very few of them, retire in their own beds.
I know, it's crazy because you think, they work, they make all this money, have all this success, but there's always somebody ready to take them out and take their place. And we see the same thing happen with the narcos in Mexico, the cartels in Mexico, where there's a lot of money and a lot of riches, but there's not a lot of long-lived happy lives out of it.
Yeah, you see it more with the older mafia guys before law enforcement really became entrenched and FBI started going after them. So a lot of the older ones, passed. The ones that didn't get killed just, ended up dying in their own beds. But certainly as years went on, it was either prison or, the morgue for a lot of them. Not all, but enough that, you're like you said, it's like, not always a happy ending.
Yeah. So back to the drug thing, the heroin trade. So one thing that was really interesting in your book, we were talking about, it seems like almost all of the heroin in the U.S. was moving through one street in Harlem. And I found that really fascinating because, you think there's a heroin trade kind of grew from there. When did the heroin trade really start taking off in the United States? Was that the late 60s?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can look at the mob's involvement back to the 1920s with heroin coming to the United States. And really, it starts really kicking into gear in terms of the mafia's involvement, especially because they were the early suppliers. And which commonly became known and made famous in a movie as the French Connection. Mm-hmm. So you had Corsican gangsters in Corsica and France, out of Marseille, refining heroin that was being brought out from the Middle East, Afghanistan, or the opium poppy fields, and it was being shipped into the United States. It was primarily Corsican gangsters on the European side and wise guys on the U.S. side. And the movie The French Connection came out in 1972, but the original case is in the early 1960s when that went down. And immediately in the aftermath of that, you just saw all these other mafia guys moving into play. So the street you're talking about is Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem. And East Harlem was predominantly an Italian area of Harlem. And that was kind of the epicenter for the mafia's heroin operations in the late 60s and early 70s. You also at that time kind of see that shift, though, moving from the European supply to the Southeast Asian supply. And, that's when things start changing in terms of the dominant ethnic organized crime groups that are controlling the drug trade.
Yeah. And that's something I was going to bring up was, he said after they broke up the Italian mobs and started shutting them down, and they shut down the Turkish and French connection, that the drug supply chains shifted. Now the Italians still had pretty much control, but now there were other, the Puerto Ricans and African American groups. They were now moving into the trade, and the trade shifted from, like you said, from the French connection to going into the Asian markets and stuff like that. So, and we're still seeing the same thing today. They call it the DEA refers to it as like a game of whack-a-mole. Anytime you stop it here, it just sprouts up over here, and they're not really able to efficiently ever stop the supply from coming in. They can just shift it.
Yeah. In fact, Nicky Barnes, who's really well known as one of the big African-American drug kingpins in the 1970s out of Harlem, his main supplier was Matthew Madonna, who was a member of the Lucchese family. Actually didn't become a member till much later, but in the 70s, he was one of the premier suppliers to Nicky Barnes and his operation. So you started seeing partnerships and deals with the Cubans and the Italians and the Puerto Ricans and the African Americans, all kind of, where there was money to be made, and they weren't really fighting over turf because there was so much money to be made. You see them operating together a lot.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering, when the DEA does these busts and it forces the spread, the markets kind of diversify and spread out, we see a lot of the negative impact of these busts because immediately there's turf wars, there's violence, there's, different gangs have to get harder to take over certain things. And this happens, each new generation can prove that they're even tougher and harder and more violent to not be messed with. And so we see the negative impacts of these busts. But do you think there are any positive impacts where these busts actually do stop some of the flow versus just causing the violence and causing the flow to move around and still come in?
Well, yeah, I think if you look at individual groups, so getting back to the Mafia, for instance, let's look at, in Florida, you had Tampa Mafia boss Santo Trafficante. He had kind of a crew of Cuban gangsters that had come over and 1960 after Castro took over. And they were running some of the early drug operations in Miami area. And then federal law enforcement started really cracking down on the mafia. So they really pushed the mob out of the wholesale supply business. Now, to your argument, yeah, other groups kind of jumped in there and took over, but they were able to kind of really, they're very successful in kind of pushing the mafia out of being a major player, because you don't see the mafia involved, especially in South Florida in the cocaine era, really hardly at all, maybe at a street level deal or small time. But, that's when the Colombians and the Cubans kind of move into those rackets. So it wasn't so much success of reducing the supply, it was success of getting entrenched groups to some extent out of the game.
Yeah, but it almost feels like, there's my dog. It almost feels like if the mob hadn't lost the control, that there might have been a better control factor of the street drugs. Because as new groups take over, they get the drugs right now are getting saturated with fentanyl and everything else, which that's a whole different issue coming from the cartels and about manufacturing costs and the cost of bringing over a smaller amount. But when you have the mafia in control, I feel like there was a certain level of, they almost had a business ethic to what they were doing. Even though what they were doing was illegal, they still had a standard of business. And then when you break them up and you push them out of the trade, smaller gangs take over the trade, and you just get more diluted and higher expensive, dangerous drugs on the streets. Is there any possible truth to that, or is that just,
I don't. That's kind of hard to say, because a lot of the mob. I'm sorry about the dog.
Is that your dog?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was my dog.
Sorry about that.
It's all right.
I think there's some truth to that, in the sense that, and I would say not just the mafia, but even like some of these early Cuban gangs that were really kind of more hierarchical structure. And then with the newer groups come in, you have more amorphous gangs that are kind of operating in and out. It's kind of hard to say, because I think there would have been a natural attrition of the mafia out of the drug rackets anyway, just because of the demographic changes. At least we'll take in South Florida, for example. A lot of the mafia guys were operating in Miami in the 60s, and then they start moving up into Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach. I think also the advent of the RICO Act and some of the penalties for getting caught with drugs really starts to dissuade some of them from getting involved in it. The other thing you have too is the real huge rise in the number of informants and people that become, government witnesses against organized crime. And a lot of that stems from the exceedingly high penalties on especially drugs. In fact, you look at someone like in the Gambino family, Angelo Ruggiero gets busted for heroin. He goes away. Him and some of the Gaudis go away for dozens of years. And faced with these kind of penalties, you see a lot of wise guys start to flip. So, it's hard to say if it would have been better if they, there's kind of like this weird mythology, and not to get off on a segue of we'll use Vegas. Like Vegas was better when the mob ran it. That's kind of hard to say, because it was a different time. There were other factors happening. So it's kind of hard to say whether the mafia would have been better stewards of the drug trade per se.
Yeah, but I think one of the difference with Vegas would be is that the mafia controlled Vegas. Gambling's legal there, so the mafia, so we don't need it on the black market. We don't need a group like the mafia to control it, and it would be in a perfect idea. We don't want the mafia to control the drug trade either. I want it to be a legal drug trade that's regulated properly. But if it's going to be in the black market, I think a more organized group would be better than just these little makeshift groups that are what we have now. And also, because of all the busts, it created just a whole culture of paranoia with the mob and with anybody running from somebody or drugs through the mob. So you have people getting shot who are just suspected of possibly being informants. Some of them were informants. Some of them might have been wrongly assumed to be informants. And even growing up, when I would go to try to find pot to buy from somebody, if I did, I felt nervous, like they're going to think I'm a cop. So I'm trying to act like I'm not a cop, which is making me act weirder. And then it's just this whole culture of paranoia that makes the drug trade just dark and icky,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's even broken down more over the years. with so many newer groups getting involved in the drug trade and other kind of drugs. One of the things you might find interesting, I was interviewing someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York for my book, and he was saying how the mafia now, it's all opioids that the gang, the younger wise guys are getting involved in, which is, potentially even more damaging, far more damaging than trafficking marijuana back in the 70s, for sure. So you start seeing some of the resultant violence from that, for sure.
And I wonder what drives them to the opioid trade now, because I guess it's, if you look at big pharma with the whole Purdue scandal, and they getting everybody addicted to opioids, and then cutting off the supply, forcing everybody who wasn't able to just stop taking them when the doctor stopped prescribing, forcing them to the streets. Now you have a whole new market of opiate addicts that are looking to buy street drugs. At the same time, you have a new drug, fentanyl, that is really cheap and really strong, that you can get a small amount across the border and then dilute and to make a huge amount. So the profit margins are just extreme right now, but also the death rates are going sky high because it's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, I just saw something online the other day about the huge rise in fentanyl overdoses in the U.S.
Yeah, the CDC said 100,000 the last 12 months. I've had different guests say that those numbers are exaggerated. They gave the reasons they said they're exaggerated, and I understand that, but I also could see how it could be the opposite. The numbers are high either way.
Yeah, even if it's half that, that's still a lot of people that are.
It's crazy. And also some people are dying. This is a little off subject, but just because of the misinformation on fentanyl. Fentanyl is extremely potent and can be extremely deadly, but it can't be inhaled or come into your skin. But cops hear this, and you had cops having panic attacks thinking they were having a fentanyl overdose, and it was just a panic attack. And we've had hospitals where someone's having an overdose, and instead of going into the room and giving them naloxone, they'll lock the door and wait for a hazmat suit person to come in because they're worried about dying from fentanyl. And this is a doctor who should know better, that you're not going to go in there and inhale fentanyl and die. But they've lost lives this way by sealing people in a room waiting for a hazmat suit while the person's overdosed. Mm-hmm. So that's just what we're dealing with right now with fentanyl. But anyway, sorry, a little tangent there.
No, that's fine. That's good stuff.
So let's see. The next thing I was going to ask you just about your writing, because you've been covering the mob for it's been most of your career, right?
Yeah. So my first, I started writing for some online publications in the late 90s, and my first book, Cigar City Mafia, about the Tampa mob, came out in 2004. So it's been almost 20 years now.
That's awesome. And you do tours in Tampa sometimes, correct?
Yeah, we do regularly. I run Tampa Mafia tours. We have with my partner, and we have another tour guy that helps us out. We've been doing that now for over 10 years, and that's as popular now as it's ever been. So we do, it's about an hour and a half, 2-hour walking tour of Ybor City, which is a historic neighborhood in Tampa. And we talk about the rise of the mafia. In fact, one of the spots we talk about is one of the headquarters of one of the largest narcotics operations in the 1920s in the South. Was headquartered out of this little storefront in Ybor City in Tampa. And it was primarily, again, narcotics that were coming up through Havana at that time, and kind of dovetailing in with the shipment of rum and other illegal liquor that was coming to the United States.
That's really cool. I'm actually really planning on taking that tour every time I go up there. It's been, but so I'm looking forward to doing that. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, another spot that's probably of interest to you is the Victor Licata house that we stopped by. I'm sure you're familiar with the Victor Licata case.
I'm not.
No.
I don't know a lot about the mafia.
So, well, Victor Licata was in October of 1933. He had a psychotic break and he murdered his family with an axe. And the house is still there where this happened. And one of the initial suspicions was that his father was involved in bootlegging, and they thought it was potentially had something to do with organized crime in Tampa. And it didn't, because the mob in Tampa, when they were killing people, was with a shotgun. But long story short, the Victor Licata case, he was a paranoid schizophrenic, but there were rumors that he liked to smoke marijuana.
I do know this guy, yes.
Yeah, so Anslinger used that case as one of the catalyst cases for the federal prohibition on marijuana.
Yep, they said he was high on cannabis and he murdered his family, and
that's which is obviously.
Oh, it's crazy.
Nothing to do with it at all. Yeah.
No, and he said that marijuana is the most violence-causing substance on the planet.
Yeah.
So if anybody who smoked it knows that's a bunch of bullshit. But Yeah, so that's that was in Tampa though. I did not know
Correct.
that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it was in Ybor City.
Well, then I'm definitely doing the tour next time I come up there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's it's really fascinating. Now, so you've been writing about the mafia your whole or for the last 20 years. Is there ever a time you're writing about something that you're scared of? You're just thinking like you should saying too much, or is it just because it's historical and in the past it's kind of like you can write about it? And have you ever been scared?
No, I really try to talk about historical stuff. I try to back everything up, even when I get into more modern type things. Like in the Hitmen, I trace some of these guys that were dealing drugs in Pleasant Avenue to some of the current heads of the mafia in New York. I really want to make sure that I have, whether it's documentation or law enforcement reports or interviewing people. I want to make sure I'm backing stuff up. That's really important to me. But generally, mafia guys, and I met people I've written about, and they're kind of whatever. They're fine. I'm not going to go writing about the Mexican cartels or with some of these incredible journalists in some of these countries do. Whether it's I'll look at even like a more we'll call it upscale country like in Europe, in Malta. These journalists getting killed by exposing organized crime. I mean, that's not something I want to do, but I can't imagine the bravery of some of these journalists covering the cartels or some of these other organizations that literally are putting their life on their line, exposing this stuff. So I stick to historical. That's my niche. That's where my comfort factor is for sure.
Yeah. So I guess if it's historical and if it's in the past and it's all documented, then there's nothing that you're exposing that they're going to be upset about.
Yeah, and the other thing is and you see this in other countries. You see this like in Japan with the Yakuza. There's a weird cultural appreciation for the mafia that you don't really see with other organized crime groups. That it's kind of part of American culture, and a lot of that has to do with the movies and popular culture itself. Even dating back to the old James Cagney movies of the 1930s, gangsters were always a popular thing. So there's a mythology that's developed around them, and people view that the same way. And it's funny because some ex-wise guys I talk about will talk about how there's these famous wiretaps from the late 90s where members of the DeCalvacante family, and I write about this in Garden State Gangland. This is a New Jersey mafia family. They're on wiretaps comparing themselves to the Sopranos, like which Sopranos are who, and that's who guys based on that. So that's one of the interesting things about writing about the mafia is you're also kind of ensconced in this pop culture realm where some of the other organized crime groups, at least in America, not so much. Now, if you go to those countries, there are like Russia with Russian organized crime, like I said, Japan with the Yakuza. So it's kind of interesting.
It's like a little bit of celebrity factor for them. So it's almost like they some might even appreciate being written about as long as it's not getting them arrested. Then.
So this ex-gangster I know once mentioned something along the lines of, anytime his name was in a paper, he'd buy a bunch of copies. And it's kind of echoes that scene in The Sopranos when Christopher's name is in the paper and he buys the whole stack of them for everyone to see.
Yeah, so there's some truth to that. And that's one thing I was going to ask you is how does Hollywood movies, like The Godfather and shows like The Soprano, how do they contrast with reality? How much of those is myth that Hollywood creates and how much is pretty close to reality?
I think The Godfather, there are parts of that are based on reality. It's obviously very fictionalized, very, epic, phenomenal movies. For example, The Godfather 2, talking about the mafia moving into Cuba. Very true. The mafia were significantly involved in pre-Castro Cuba. And, they talk about how when Castro took over, they're at that party in The Godfather 2 and they all leave the country. That, echoed what happened in real life. But movies, I think like Goodfellas is, from people I've talked to, from what I've read, very close to kind of how it is. A lot of not so glamorous stuff, especially at the end when, he's all coked up and that whole thing. It's kind of a grind for some of these guys. And you'll see some movies, like there's a scene in the movie Donnie Brasco where Al Pacino's looking for money and he's trying to break open a parking meter. I mean, these guys, it's a long ways away from the epic Godfather type stuff. So.
Yeah. That's one thing I was going to ask you is if you had a favorite gangster movie. I know you said that Goodfellas kind of got you into what you know.
Yeah, I'd say Goodfellas as a movie. the Godfather series I love. I've really grown to appreciate Casino over the years. I think it's an underrated Scorsese movie. In terms of TV, obviously The Sopranos, but there's been a TV show recently. It's been out the past few years. It's out of Italy. It's out of Naples, called Gomorrah. It's about the Neapolitan Camorra, which is one of the largest Italian organized crime groups, and almost exclusively drugs, cocaine. And it's just incredible, unbelievably gritty, very violent, but fantastic TV show that really kind of shows the mafia the total opposite end of The Godfather, kind of glamorized. It's really street level and just super gritty. So
very cool. Gomorrah. Have to check that out. Yeah. So another question is, just curious, if you could go back in time, have a cigar and a bourbon with any of the gangsters you've written about, any of the people, the characters, that is there a particular person that you would love to just sit down and be able to talk to, live or dead?
Well, I've written a lot about Tampa. So Santo Trafficante Jr., who was a longtime Tampa mob boss from the 50s through his death in 87. But he spent a lot of time, he owned a lot of casinos in pre-Castro Cuba. So yeah, my time machine would be going back to like the Hotel Capri in 1958, maybe having a cigar and a bourbon with him then. Some of them, Meyer Lansky is another one. I think from people I've known and family members I've talked to said he was very well read, very well spoken, very good conversationalist. The flip side of that, I've heard some of the others, weren't the brightest bulbs in the basket. So maybe wouldn't be, but I think Santo Trafficante and Meyer Lansky would be two I think would be interesting from a historical perspective to have a conversation with them, because some of the stuff that they were involved in were pivotal to, big parts of American history. And that's the thing I think a lot of people don't realize about the mafias, especially in the early part of the 20th century, how closely aligned they were with very big, even geopolitical things that were happening.
And they had to be involved with certain payoffs of officers and being. And I was wondering about that, because when you said the one that was very well read, and then you have others that are just more. So it's like brains and brawn, but it doesn't take. We think of gangsters as being like the most violent wins, but it also has to be someone who knows how to use their brain. So is that a kind of a thing that you'll see reoccurring, where you'll see like highly educated, well read people that are just in that life, have just been raised that way, but are super educated and smart, but running.
Yeah, and you'll say highly educated, kind of street education. So people like Meyer Lansky didn't go to school, but they were very keen to make sure their sons went to college, or their kids didn't have to go into that life. But that's one of the things, and the gangsters I've spoken to, or someone that I know, even ones that didn't have a formal education past high school, some didn't even finish high school. There are a certain subset of them that are well read and have some type of business acumen. And there was a great line. So Harlan Blackburn, who was head of a group called the Cracker Mob out of Orlando, and he was big time gangster for 40 some years in Florida. And his lawyer, during one of his last sentencing before he passed away, his lawyer said, had he been born under different circumstances, he would have been a great director of the Florida lottery. So, some of them especially in the early years, just by virtue of where they were born or didn't have the same opportunities or just came up a different way, probably could have been really successful. Jerry Katina, a gangster nobody's ever heard of, a gangster that lived into his 90s and barely spent any time in prison, owned dozens of companies, was heavily involved in all kinds of major business dealings in New Jersey. It's a perfect example of someone that was really smart about what he did. He was kind of behind the scenes and didn't, get out in front of the camera or strut down the street like John Gotti or Al Capone kind of thing.
Yeah. And I wonder how many businesses today that are very successful and legal started as an illegal operation, that they just turned it around and now they were built on the backbone of an illegal operation.
Oh yeah, there are quite a few. And liquor distributorships are still some that are around now that started right after Prohibition. Yeah, there are a lot. Some of the gaming companies, Bally Gaming, that was a company that Jerry Katina had an interest in way back when it started. It's obviously, publicly traded company right now. But yeah, there are a number of them that got their start either through investment of organized crime or actually started as organized crime ventures that kind of went legitimate over the time.
Is any of the skyline, and because everybody talks about the skyline in Miami was built by a cocaine. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of that's exaggeration, but is there any of the skyline in Tampa or anywhere you think comes from Prohibition era money or, drug money?
Not really in Tampa as much. I know Miami, a lot of it was financed and through the banks, especially in the 80s during that kind of heyday of the cocaine era. But yeah, Tampa, not so much. It was definitely more low key, and things weren't quite as flashy as they were in Miami, for sure.
Was there a heavier law presence in Tampa that would have cracked the whip a little harder than Miami?
It wasn't necessarily a heavier law presence. Part of it was that the Mafia in Tampa were a lot more under the radar. They were way more heavily involved in illegal gambling than anything. There were some that were involved in drugs, but as the years went on, that kind of lessened. And by the time the 80s rolled around, they started, and Santo Trafficante dies in 1987. The people that follow him really start moving into more legitimate businesses. So you start seeing the Mafia, unlike other cities where either law enforcement took care of the Mafia. In Tampa, it's just kind of faded away over time, attrition. So a lot of their sons and nephews didn't get into the family business. So as the old timers passed away, there's nobody there to take their place. So it kind of starts to fade away.
But they might have also had some of the money passed down to them from those operations, but were put into legal markets
So some of the real estate you'll see early on, like Ybor City, some of the early renovations of Ybor, you'll see some familiar names, and then that's been sold and converted to other things over the years.
Yeah. And I'm wondering how much so we talk about the drugs being a big part of the Mafia, but also talking to you, I'm realizing that was only one, piece of the pie. Cause like you said, gambling was huge. There was racketeering and also protection, going into a shop and say, I'll protect your shop from the other gangs. You got to pay me a kickback. So how much of the Mafia early on, say from their, when they first got into the United States to their heyday, would have changed if drugs if it never made the black market, if drugs had stayed in some form, one way or another, legal? Would the mob have been nearly as powerful as they became without the drugs?
Yeah, I think they would have. And there's two reasons for that. Number one is they still had they were very diversified into what they did. So already by post-prohibition, you see them getting involved in trucking, the garment industry, labor racketeering was really a big thing that kind of gave them the power. Illegal gambling. So if the drugs weren't there, I still think they would be able to fill that gap with the other rackets that they were involved in, and their political power base, where they derived their political power, was still there. The other thing that would have helped them was if there was no Bureau of Narcotics, because the Bureau of Narcotics was the first federal law enforcement organization to really say, hey, there's a national network of the Mafia, long before the FBI kind of freely admitted it. So the Bureau of Narcotics was the first federal agency that started really investigating the Mafia at kind of a national level. So if the Bureau of Narcotics wasn't there from the federal perspective, that might have benefited the Mafia, looking back in hindsight. So yeah, actually, if drugs were legal, they might have been potentially bigger. Certainly would still have a lot of that.
That's crazy. Because when I was reading Johan Hari's book, he talks about, when Harry Anslinger took over the Bureau of Narcotics, the first thing he did, because alcohol prohibition was coming to an end, so to keep his division alive, was outlaw the other drugs and immediately start stopping prescriptions for addicts from doctors and going after the doctors who were still prescribing opiates, shutting that down. And there was the theory that he was helping the Mafia. It was helping the Mafia so much that he might have been involved with the Mafia, which, like I said, there's no actual evidence to back that up other than the Mafia seemed to benefit from the black market. But like you said, he also went after the Mafia, and he was the first one, because I think a lot of people back then thought he was crazy, thought the Mafia was nonsense. It wasn't a real thing.
Yeah.
But he was like, no, it's real. And if I'm not mistaken, right? When you said that the Bureau of Narcotics, he was the head of that when they first went after the Mafia, correct?
Yeah, yeah. And then yeah, but now I might be double thinking myself. Maybe, yeah. That it's hard to say really. One of the things that I do know is it George White? He was the head of the Bureau of Narcotics for a while, correct?
I'm not sure.
There was somebody, it wasn't Anslinger, but it was after him, who I know for a fact was meeting with Mafia guys. He met with Trafficante in Tampa. He was going around to different cities. And then you could start getting into, maybe, I don't want to say conspiracy because it's true, but more ties between like some of the stuff that the CIA was doing with the Mafia, anti-Castro stuff that kind of bleeds over into some of the early CIA involvement in drug trafficking, which is kind of goes down a little bit of another, path, but there's interesting ties there for sure. So it wouldn't surprise me if Anslinger was, playing both sides.
He could have been. Like I said, from what I've read, there's no actual evidence to support it. And it does seem like it's not the case, that it just happened to work out that what he was doing was benefiting the Mafia, but he was just kind of aloof on the way that his drug policy was going to have such a negative impact. He was very anti-drugs. The book Chasing the Scream was based on the fact that when he was a young child, he heard his neighbors screaming. There was a woman screaming, and the husband ran down the stairs and gave him a note and said, "Run to the pharmacy." And he went and got these opiates from the pharmacy and went and ran back to the woman. And as soon as she took them, she stopped screaming. And from then he decided drugs were evil. He wanted no part of them. And that's when the author of the book, Johan Hari, said he was basically felt like he was chasing that scream all around the world, studying the war on drugs and prohibition. Because that's really where it began, was when that kid heard that scream. And it's hard to say if Harry Anslinger hadn't taken over the Bureau, would prohibition still have happened on some level? And with the way that this country operates with our puritanical backbone and all that, it seems like prohibition was somehow inevitable. I'd like to think it wasn't, but I just feel like it was here. I don't know. Yeah,
it could have been. Yeah, and another thing I'm thinking of too with the Mafia, when you're talking about the drug thing, had they not been involved in it, one of the other interesting things is the reason, there was the twofold reason that the one of them I mentioned earlier is law enforcement really started cracking down on them. But the other thing is they were getting outmaneuvered by some of the other, up and coming drug gangs. So it's interesting to think if there wasn't a prohibition, how that would have affected things.
Yeah,
because the Mafia were still involved in the liquor industry heavily after Prohibition, both through liquor distributorships, ownership of, they owned a lot of bars and restaurants, which of course is a great way to launder money, all cash business. So, you wonder if they would have been involved in a legal sense with narcotics in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, well, it's like, I wonder if we legalize the cocaine trade, are we going to, the current cartels, are they going to keep the supply chains and become where we get the cocaine from? Are we going to try to shut them down? And, how's that going to fold? But if you look at prohibition with alcohol, a lot of those suppliers did become the first alcohol companies, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of them that were making alcohol beforehand just went to the medicinal alcohol and then would switch back. And then, the other thing with alcohol too is you had every other country in the world was producing it and was legal. So, there was no shortage of supply. It was just getting the supply to where the demand was.
Yeah, that's what you were talking about in the Garden State book, was which I found really fascinating. I didn't know a lot about Atlantic City, and now I want to watch Boardwalk Empire. But it's when you're saying that they were just basically, they could just come almost to the coast with these huge ships with booze in international waters, and then these speedboats would just go out and grab it and take it to Atlantic City. So was Atlantic City during Prohibition, was it kind of a city that if you could just basically go and get drunk in bars and no one really cared as long as you were cool about it?
Yeah, it was a resort community, and it was a lot more open. Some cities like that were a lot more open as to where you can drink. And Atlantic City was probably one of, if you didn't make a spectacle of yourself, and because a lot of the local politicians were greased, were paid off, and some of the local police were paid off.
It's really fascinating. I think that's the reason alcohol prohibition did not work and why other drug prohibition, it's not working either, but it's different because you don't have places you can just go and buy cocaine and heroin and party with your friends. It's not like you have to have a sketchy guy or get it from, this. It's not what it was with prohibition with alcohol. I think alcohol is just a universally enjoyed drug that most people enjoy, to where even cops are going to be like, we'll turn the other way because when we get off, we're going to have one ourselves.
Yeah, I think that, and I think you're definitely seeing that with marijuana. How that's just even looking at polls over the last 10 years, the way people's viewpoint of marijuana has changed just dramatically since the legalization push started.
It has. Three-fourths of Floridians want or support cannabis legalization for recreational use. Marco Rubio just responded to my letter saying that he does not support it. No shock there. But we'll see what happens.
I'm sure he had absolutely no reason why he doesn't support it either.
Oh, he gave reasons. It was his biggest reason was because of the current drug crisis and what message it would send the kids. It's like, don't call it a drug crisis because you're putting cannabis in the same pot as opioids, and it's not. And opioids are the ones people are dying from, mixed with benzos and other things. Cannabis, if they'd switched to cannabis, you'd see the deaths go down. So putting those together, but it's all politics, right?
Yeah, but I think you're seeing too, and Nevada, for instance, because I go out to Vegas a lot. I'm on the advisory council of the Mob Museum out there, which is a great, fantastic museum, and it's right in downtown Vegas. Perfect location for a mob museum. But they have now, they're building like lounges and all kinds of stuff. Like actually, instead of a bar, they're having cannabis lounges they're building, and I don't think you're seeing the issues that people, the sky is falling gloom and doomers predicted as a result of the legalization of that.
No, and you're not going to. And also, I really don't think you will if you legalize heroin either. Now, when I say that, I don't mean the same way we do recreational cannabis. No, but if somebody who's an addict could go to their doctor and get the drug they're addicted to, I feel like it's going to be a lot better than the way we're doing it right now. And it's strange, when I started this podcast, I don't think I believed that heroin was not something I was really interested in talking about, and then started the Peace on Drugs podcast and talked to opiate addicts, and my whole perspective changed on the way we handle the drug problem in this country. Yeah.
And I have a friend of mine who I would recommend you reach out to, be a great podcast guest, Seth Ferrante.
Seth Ferrante, I feel like
he did 20 some years in prison for dealing LSD, and he's doing a couple documentaries. Actually, he has a documentary coming out called Dope Man, about which I was interviewed for, about the mafia's involvement in early narcotics trafficking, and one on LSD. And that's another thing, like LSD and mushrooms. You're seeing a lot more about that coming out, about this concept of microdosing and using that as an enhancement rather than something where you tripping for 10 hours or whatever. But so yeah, maybe there's a sea change in the way some of this is being viewed, at least.
There definitely is. And another thing we're seeing is the decriminalization. And that's what my first focus as far as this is to destigmatize drug use. And we need to talk about decriminalizing the way Oregon did. Personal use. If you have a personal drug on you, how does your local community want to handle it? It's one thing. Give them a mandatory therapy if you want to handle it that way, but making it a crime is ridiculous. Let's say if someone wants to do cocaine and they're an adult and they have it on them, they're not a criminal and they don't deserve a criminal record. And that's the first thing we got to stop doing, is arresting people for personal things like that.
Yeah, I think there's a definite argument to be made for that, for sure. And retroactive to people that, and I think some states you're starting to see that with people that had nonviolent marijuana possession convictions being, having their records expunged.
You're not seeing it enough. And even in places like Colorado that have had recreational for a long time, anybody that has a criminal record from cannabis prior to being legal is they still have a record. And same in Michigan. So it's same in pretty much all the states. And I know in the MORE Act, they're talking about a federal expunging of cannabis records, but the act probably won't pass because they're going to piggyback too much bullshit onto the bill that the other sides won't agree on. And these, this piggybacking of bills is just so ridiculous. I don't know if I'm sure you were voting in Florida when they had that. Do you want to ban offshore drilling and indoor vaping? Same bill. Same vote. Right? I vape, so if I want to vape indoors, but the offshore drilling. So of course they got me to vote against my own interest because I chose the environment. But it's just, Those are two, that's how our country operates for some reason.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, it was so good talking to you, and I'm enjoying your book. Thank you for sending it to me. And do you want to say anything about your book? Give a quick plug where people can find it.
Sure. Yeah. My latest book, Hitmen, the Mafia, Drugs, and the East Harlem Purple Gang, is just released. You can find it on Barnes & Noble, some local booksellers, and Amazon. And my Tampa Mafia tours for anyone that's in the Tampa area. We don't do them in the summer because it's a little hot to be walking around in the middle of July in downtown Ybor. But from September through the end of May, we run the tours. So you can go to tampamafia.com.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for doing this, and it was good meeting you, and I can't wait to do your tour. I guess it'll probably be in September then or sometime after that.
Yeah, just shoot me an email. I'll let you know when our next one is.
I will. I look forward to it.
Awesome. All right. Thanks again.
Peace out.
All right.
All right. Peace, Nicks. Same as always, if you like what we're doing, go to Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star rating. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter at the Peace on Drugs Podcast. And subscribe to our newsletter at www.thepeaceondrugs.com/subscribe. And share it with your friends. Share the message. Be a part of the movement. We have to change people's minds on drug addiction, stigma, everything else that goes around. We need to work towards decriminalizing. And write your senator, write your congressman. What's the harm that can come from letting them know where you stand and what you want the legislation to be, what laws you want changed? That's what we can do with this podcast. That's what we can do with this movement. If you agree with me, and I know you do, then there's a little more we can do than going out and vote for the one candidate that's not going to make anything happen anyway. We can write our congressmen. We can write our senators. We can go to local rallies and meetings and stand up for something. Let's try and make a difference in this world. That's what we're doing, right? We're trying to make a difference. Thank you so much for joining me. I love you all. We're going to hand it over to Twiggy Branches to take us on out of here. Peace out.
Doctor